What if the strongest form of rebellion today isn't loud, angry, or visible at all, but lives quietly inside a story fans choose to believe? What if a relationship that has never been officially named becomes a symbol powerful enough to challenge how society defines love? This is where the conversation around Jikook begins, not as a rumor, not as a claim of fact, but as a narrative that refuses to fit into a narrow frame. Jikook, the bond between Jimin and Jungkook, has long been discussed as something emotionally intense, deeply rooted, and unusually consistent. For many fans, especially in the United States, the idea of Jikook as a married pair is not about legal status or public announcements. It is about symbolism. It is about imagining love beyond rigid expectations that say relationships must follow one straight line to be considered real. In mainstream pop culture, there is an unspoken rule that has existed for decades. Male artists can show closeness, affection, and vulnerability, but only up to a point. That closeness is expected to stay safe, brotherly, and easily explainable. Eventually, the story is supposed to resolve itself into a heterosexual narrative that feels familiar and socially acceptable. Dating rumors, marriage news, and family life often follow that path, reinforcing the idea that anything outside of it is temporary or unreal. Against that backdrop, the Jikook narrative feels disruptive to some fans in the best possible way. Their bond has never been loud or aggressively defined. Instead, it has been steady. Fans point to years of shared experiences, emotional reliance, trust during vulnerable moments, and a sense of mutual grounding that seems to persist regardless of external circumstances. For supporters of this interpretation, the power lies in that consistency, not in labels. This is where the idea of marriage enters the conversation, not as a literal claim, but as emotional language. In fandom spaces, marriage often symbolizes permanence, choice, and commitment. When fans describe Jikook this way, they are not necessarily saying they are romantically or legally married. They are expressing the belief that this bond represents something enduring, chosen, and deeply personal, outside the traditional structure society usually demands. The reason this idea resonates so strongly is because it pushes back against heteronormativity, the assumption that straight relationships are the default and ultimate destination. For many fans, especially queer fans, seeing two men emotionally prioritize each other without forcing that bond into a straight explanation feels meaningful. It opens a space where love does not have to be categorized to be valid. At the same time, this interpretation is undeniably controversial. Critics argue that framing Jikook as a married couple crosses personal boundaries and risks projecting identities onto real people. These concerns are not ignored within the fandom. Many fans openly discuss the line between interpretation and intrusion, acknowledging that Jimin and Jungkook are real individuals with private lives. Yet, the narrative persists, and that persistence itself becomes part of the story. Supporters argue that imagining a symbolic same-sex partnership is treated far more harshly than assuming heterosexual relationships. When idols are paired with women and rumors, it is often seen as harmless speculation. But when fans imagine something that challenges straight norms, it is quickly labeled inappropriate or delusional. This double standard is what fuels the feeling of resistance. In US fandom spaces, the conversation often expands beyond Jikook themselves. Fans connect this narrative to broader cultural issues, such as the lack of emotional freedom allowed to men, especially men in the public eye. Jimin and Jungkook's closeness is read as a challenge to the idea that masculinity must be emotionally distant or romantically limited to one socially approved form. For these fans, the symbolic marriage becomes less about romance and more about emotional truth. It represents the idea that two people can choose each other as their primary emotional support, regardless of gender or labels. That idea alone feels radical in a culture that constantly demands clarification and categorization. This is also why many fans emphasize that the narrative is symbolic. They talk about it as a story, a framework, a way of understanding a bond that feels deeper than ordinary friendship, but does not need to be explained through conventional terms. In this sense, Jikook becomes a canvas. Fans project their hopes, their struggles, and their desire for a more flexible definition of love onto that bond. The sensitivity of this topic lies in the tension between respect and imagination. Fans who support this narrative often stress that they are not claiming insider knowledge or hidden truths. They are engaging in meaning-making, something fandoms have always done. Stories are built not only from what is said, but from what is felt, repeated, and emotionally recognized by the audience. As debates continue, the narrative evolves. Some fans soften the language, describing Jikook as life partners or soul-connected rather than married. Others hold on to the marriage metaphor precisely because of its cultural weight. Marriage represents legitimacy in many societies, and reclaiming that word for a same-sex bond, even symbolically, feels like an act of quiet defiance. This is why attempts to shut down the narrative often fail. Every argument against it brings the conversation back into focus. Every criticism highlights the discomfort society still has with non-heteronormative interpretations. Instead of fading away, the idea becomes sharper, more intentional, and more openly discussed. What is often overlooked is that this narrative says as much about the audience as it does about Jikook. Fans are not just watching idols, they are negotiating their own relationship with love, identity, and freedom. For many, the symbolic marriage of Jikook represents a version of connection that feels safe, chosen, and emotionally honest, without needing approval from traditional systems. In that sense, the controversy is not a flaw, but a feature. It exposes the limits of accepted narratives and highlights why alternative interpretations matter to so many people. The story continues because it has not been proven, but because it fills a space that reality often leaves empty. As this conversation keeps circulating through timelines, videos, and comment sections, it continues to invite the same question again and again. Why does imagining love outside heteronormative rules feel so threatening, and why does it feel so necessary at the same time? In the end, the narrative of Jikook as a symbolic marriage is less about defining Jimin and Jungkook and more about challenging the limits placed on how love is allowed to exist in public imagination. For many fans, this story becomes a quiet form of resistance, a way to say that connection does not need to follow a fixed script to be meaningful. It reflects a desire for love that is emotionally honest, chosen freely, and not constrained by gender expectations or social pressure. This is why the discussion around Jikook never truly settles. It continues because it speaks to something unresolved, not just in fandom culture, but in society at large. As long as emotional intimacy between men is questioned, minimized, or forced into narrow categories, fans will keep searching for narratives that feel more expansive and more human. If this perspective resonates with you, or even if it challenges you, join the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments, engage respectfully with different views, and let us know how you interpret the Jikook narrative. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more in-depth fandom discussions, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story shaping the Jikook conversation.